New York has more of these ghost towns than most people realize. Some were bought out and drowned beneath reservoirs that still supply the city today. At least one of those places was abandoned twice, revived twice, and is now sitting empty in the Adirondacks with a story that has nothing to do with mining. In 1826, two men named Archibald McIntyre and David Henderson found iron ore on the banks of the upper Hudson River, deep in the Adirondacks, and decided to build a town around it. What they put up was substantial: a blast furnace, a forge, a grist mill, a sawmill, charcoal and brick kilns, worker housing, the full infrastructure of a functioning iron operation in the middle of wilderness. They named the village Adirondac, and for about 30 years it ran. Then, in 1858, it collapsed. McIntyre had died. The economy turned. A flood damaged the works, and the location that had always made the operation difficult finally made it impossible. There was no practical way to move iron out of those mountains at a price that made sense. The village emptied. The forest moved back in. That should be the end of the story. It isn't. In September 1901, Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was staying at the Tahawus Club, a hunting and fishing retreat built near the old abandoned village site, when a messenger reached him on the trail coming down from Mount Marcy. President William McKinley, shot by an assassin in Buffalo 8 days earlier, was dying. Roosevelt had been told McKinley was recovering. He had gone hiking. Now he had to get to Buffalo as fast as possible. He climbed into a wagon in the middle of the night and rode 35 miles of mountain road to the nearest rail station. By the time he reached Buffalo, McKinley was dead. Theodore Roosevelt became the 26th President of the United States. The story does not end there either. In 1941, a second mining operation moved into the Tahawus site, this time for titanium dioxide. National Lead Industries ran the operation for nearly 5 decades, pulling 40 million tons of material out of those mountains before shutting down for good in 1989. The village emptied again. The land passed to public management and is open Adirondack wilderness today. The road in still runs past the old mine works, and somewhere in the trees above it is the cottage where a vice president learned he was about to become president. Most people who hike Bear Mountain State Park in Rockland County have no idea they are walking through a town. Doodletown sits in the Hudson Highlands, and the trails running through it pass over foundations and past cellar holes that most hikers assume are just rocks. They are not. Families were living here from the late 1700s. It grew slowly into a self-contained community, the kind of place where several generations of the same family might spend their entire lives without much reason to leave. Then, World War II pulled the men out, and the families followed. New York State had been quietly acquiring parcels of Doodletown land since 1910, one property at a time, absorbing it into what would become the state park. By 1962, the state owned everything. The last residents left in 1965. As each family went, the house they left behind was demolished. Not preserved, not repurposed, knocked down. Today, more than 30 signs stand in the woods marking where specific buildings once stood. A school, houses, the structures that defined a neighborhood for nearly 2 centuries, identified now by small markers in the trees. The schoolhouse itself survived longer than most. It was still standing in 1980, when repeated vandalism finally made demolition the only practical answer. Number 11 is a completely different kind of disappearance. No slow decline, no war, no reservoir. What ended that community was buried under it for decades before anyone realized it was there. And when they finally did, it triggered a change in federal law that is still in effect today. The cemetery still grows in the middle of the state park, and the people buried there have no neighbors left. Love Canal was designed to be a dream, a model industrial city powered by cheap hydroelectric energy. and the man who conceived it spent years digging the canal that would make it possible. William T. Love had a plan in the 1890s to connect the upper and lower Niagara rivers with a short canal, generate electricity from the drop in elevation, and build an entire industrial city around that power. The financial panic of 1893 killed his funding. By 1910, all that remained of the vision was a partially dug ditch on the eastern edge of Niagara Falls. That ditch sat unused for 30 years. Then in 1942, Hooker Chemical Company, with full government sanction, began dumping into it. For 11 years, they used that abandoned canal as a chemical waste disposal site. When they were finished, 21,000 tons of toxic material were buried there, including at least 12 known carcinogens. In 1953, Hooker covered the site and sold the land to the Niagara Falls School Board for $1. An elementary school went up directly on top of it. Nearly 1,000 homes were built in the surrounding neighborhood. Families moved in. Children played outside. In 1978, a woman named Lois Gibbs started asking questions about why so many children in her neighborhood were sick. What she found was that her home and every home around it sat on top of one of the most contaminated pieces of ground in the country. She organized her neighbors. She fought the city, the state, and the federal government for 3 years. The neighborhood was eventually evacuated. Homes were demolished. The Love Canal disaster became the direct catalyst for the Superfund Act, the federal law that gave the government authority and funding to clean up sites like it. Parts of the area were declared habitable again in the early 1990s. Most of it was not. The block after block of empty driveways and overgrown foundations is still there, and the wildlife that moved back in has no idea what is underneath it. For about 100 years, the Catskill Mountains were where wealthy New Yorkers went, and the Overlook Mountain House was meant to be the crown of all of it. From the 1820s through the 1920s, the Catskills were the premier resort destination in the country. Not the Adirondacks, not the Jersey Shore. The Catskills. And the Overlook sat higher than any other hotel in the range, looking down at all of it, the highest hotel in the mountains. The first Overlook Mountain House opened in 1871 with room for 300 guests. It burned in 1875. They rebuilt it. That version burned in 1923. A Philadelphia industrialist named Morris Newgold had purchased the property by then, and he was not done. He hired an architect and decided this time the building would be concrete. No more fires, no more starting over. Construction began in 1928, and it was never finished. The problem was access. The Overlook sat at the highest elevation of any hotel in the range and had no direct connection to a rail line. Getting guests up the mountain was a genuine logistical problem that nobody solved. Newgold ran out of money before the walls were complete. New York State acquired the land in 1940 and boarded up what was there. A fire in the mid-1960s took down the rooftop tower that had managed to survive everything else. Concrete walls open to the sky, windows without glass, a curved staircase going up to floors that were never finished, a fireplace, a fountain. In 1995, an artist installed reproductions of old Overlook brochures and photographs inside the ruins, placing images of former guests directly beside the windows where those same guests once stood. The curved staircase and the fireplace are still there on the mountain, waiting in a building that was never finished for guests who stopped coming before the walls went up. There is a Scottish castle on an island in the Hudson River, and most people who have driven that stretch of the valley their whole lives have seen it from the road and never known what it was. Polypel Island sits about 50 miles north of New York City in the Hudson, a 6.5-acre patch of rock that has been uninhabited for decades. The man who built what is on it was Francis Bannerman, a Scottish-born arms dealer raised in Brooklyn, who started buying military surplus after the Civil War while still in his teens. By the time the Spanish-American War ended, his operation had purchased roughly 90% of all captured Spanish arms. The volume was so large, his Manhattan storehouse could no longer safely hold it. 30 million surplus munitions cartridges needed somewhere to go. He bought the island in 1900 and started building. What went up over the next 2 decades was deliberately designed to resemble a Scottish castle. Multiple structures, towers, and thick stone walls rose on the island. It was a working arsenal, but it was also something else entirely. Bannerman had his name cast directly into the wall facing the western bank of the river. Anyone passing by on the water or on the shoreline road could read it. The castle served as a storage facility and as a billboard at the same time. In August 1920, 200 pounds of shells and powder exploded in one of the ancillary structures. Part of the complex was destroyed. Bannerman had already died the year before. A ferry that had served the island sank in a storm in 1950, and after that, the island went effectively silent. Fire tore through the arsenal in 1969. A portion of the outer wall collapsed in 2009. Tours have run since 1992, and they are accessible by boat from Beacon. The name is still cast into the riverside wall, exactly where Bannerman put it, advertising a business that has been gone for over a century. At its peak, Parksville in Sullivan County had around 100 hotels and bungalow colonies, and was one of the most visited summer destinations in the entire Northeast. The Ontario and Western Railway made that possible. When the line connected Sullivan County to New York City at the turn of the 20th century, the Catskill foothills became reachable for a weekend, and families came in waves. First the wealthy, then the Jewish resort community that turned this corridor into the Borscht Belt, a network of hotels and summer colonies that stretched across Sullivan County and meant something profound to several generations of New York families. Parksville was near the center of it. Young's Gap, the Grand Hotel, the Prospect Inn, the Tansville, the Paramount Resort, and dozens of bungalow colonies packed the hills around town. These were not small operations. Families returned to the same hotel every summer for decades. Children grew up there, in the same dining rooms, with the same entertainment staff, on the same lake. At its height, roughly 100 properties surrounded that single Sullivan County town. Then the whole thing unwound, hotel by hotel. The Grand closed in 1964. The Prospect Inn closed in 1965. Young's Gap closed in 1967. The collapse was not dramatic. There was no fire, no flood, no single afternoon that ended it. Cheaper air travel opened Florida and the Caribbean to the same families who had been driving north every June. The Catskills stopped feeling necessary. By the time the Paramount Resort closed in 2000, everything else had already been dark for years. Route 17 became Interstate 86, and the new alignment pushed traffic around Parksville rather than through it. Local business owners tried to bring the town back in the late 80s and the 90s. A few cafes, a few shops. It was not enough. The population still sits in the hundreds, technically alive. The streets are mostly empty now. The interstate passes around the town rather than through it, and what remains looks less like a living community and more like the last frame of a home movie nobody has watched in 40 years. There is an island in the East River between the Bronx and Rikers Island that has been closed to the public for 60 years. The 20 acres of buildings rotting inside an uncleared forest contain 2 of the most disturbing stories in New York City history. New York City purchased the island in 1885 to build a quarantine hospital. 20 acres in the middle of the river were separated from the city by enough water to keep tuberculosis, smallpox, typhoid, and measles contained on one side. What happened there is a different question entirely. Mary Mallon arrived on North Brother Island in 1907. She was Irish-born, a cook, and linked to 22 confirmed typhoid cases across 7 separate households. The thing that made her case genuinely strange was that she had no symptoms. She felt completely healthy. She did not believe she was sick, and nothing in her visible condition suggested otherwise. Health authorities quarantined her on the island anyway, from 1907 to 1910. When they released her, the condition was simple: never work as a cook again. She went straight back to cooking under a different name. More people got sick. She was returned to the island in 1915 and remained there until she died in 1938. She spent 23 years on 20 acres. At least 51 confirmed infections occurred over her lifetime. But the worst single day in the island's history came 2 years before Mary Mallon ever arrived. In 1905, the steamship General Slocum, carrying more than 1,000 passengers, caught fire in the East River and was grounded roughly 25 feet from the island's shore. Rescuers reached the wreck and pulled survivors onto the island's banks. It was not enough. Over 1,000 people died. It was the largest loss of life in New York City history until September 11, 2001. The bodies washed ashore on North Brother Island for days afterward. The hospital operated until 1943, then briefly reopened in the 1950s as a treatment facility for adolescent drug users before closing permanently in 1963. 25 original buildings are still standing behind 30 years of unchecked forest, and you need a permit and a compelling academic reason to get anywhere near them. Roland Lindemann opened the Catskill Game Farm in 1933 with a collection of exotic deer and a banker's confidence that families from New York City would drive up to feed them. He was right. Lindemann had no background in zoology beyond a personal obsession, but he understood the Catskills. It was close enough to the city for a day trip, with cool air in the summer. And by 1946, the farm had bison, yaks, llamas, camels, mountain lions, and 50 acres of open feeding ground where visitors walked directly among the animals. No fence between you and a camel. That was the whole idea. The post-war baby boom sent families up in enormous numbers. Parents wanted somewhere to take children. Children wanted to hand-feed something large and strange. And the Catskill Game Farm was exactly that. Business peaked in the 1960s. For 30 years, it ran at the center of a regional tourism economy that seemed permanent. Then, the same decades that had built it started pulling people elsewhere. Theme parks drew families farther away, and Catskill tourism generally began its long decline. The farm changed hands within the family in 1989, when Lindemann's daughter Kathy Schultz took it over. But the trajectory did not change. In August 2006, the announcement came. The Catskill Game Farm would close on October 9th of that year, ending 73 years of operation. The animals were transferred to facilities across the country. The property sat empty and largely untouched for most of a decade after that. New owners purchased it in 2012. The Giraffe Barn is a hotel now, and the 50-acre feeding ground where post-war families once walked among camels and llamas is gone without a trace. Kensico was a real Westchester village with a church, a post office, and families who had been living there for generations. It disappeared because New York City needed somewhere to put its water. By the 1880s, the city was growing faster than its water supply could keep up with. The answer was the new Croton Aqueduct system, and eventually that system required a reservoir large enough to serve a city that was not stopping. The Kensico Valley was the location they chose. The entire village was condemned in the 1890s. Residents were bought out at appraised prices. Buildings were either demolished or physically moved. The community was dispersed, and a new Kensico was established on higher ground nearby. Same name, entirely different place, entirely different set of people. The original village went under the water. Construction on the Kensico Dam began in 1891. The structure, completed in 1917, is one of the largest masonry dams ever built in the United States. The reservoir it holds back covers what used to be a functioning Westchester community. Farms, a church, a post office, neighbors who had known each other their whole lives. All of it condemned and flooded so that the city to the south could keep growing. Today, the Kensico Reservoir feeds drinking water to roughly 4 million New York City residents every day. The dam is considered an engineering landmark. Visitors walk the plaza at its base and take photographs of the stonework. The original village is still sitting at the bottom of the reservoir. Letchworth Village in Rockland County was designed in 1911 to be a model community, and for a time it looked like one. The state built it on 2,300 acres as a progressive campus for people with developmental and intellectual disabilities. Separate cottages instead of wards, farms, a school, a power plant, a full working community meant to be humane by the standards of its era. At its peak, more than 4,000 residents lived there. Then funding stopped keeping pace with the population, and by the 1950s the place had become something else entirely. Overcrowded, understaffed, buildings holding far more people than they were designed to hold. In 1950, Dr. Hilary Koprowski tested an experimental oral polio vaccine on residents at Letchworth Village. The families were not asked. The residents were not informed. The test contributed to research that eventually helped produce a working polio vaccine, though that fact offered little comfort to the people who were used to produce it. The institution kept filling. The conditions kept declining. In the early 1970s, a young television reporter named Geraldo Rivera got a camera inside. What he showed the country was residents lying on bare concrete floors, emaciated, unclothed, with no meaningful care around them. The footage aired nationally. The response was immediate and wide. What happened at Letchworth became a turning point in how the country thought about institutionalization, not just in New York, but everywhere. States began moving people out of facilities like this one and into community-based care. It was a slow process, and at Letchworth, it took decades. The last residents were transferred out in 1996. 85 years after the state opened it as a model of progressive care, the campus went quiet. 130 buildings have been sitting empty since then, and the power plant chimney is still visible from the highway. Neversink was a farming community in Sullivan County with a church, neighbors who had worked the same valley land for generations, and no particular reason to expect that any of it would end. The valley sat along the west branch of the Neversink River in the Catskills, settled in the early 1800s by farming families who stayed. They built on the land, buried their dead there, and passed it to the next generation. By the mid-20th century, some of those families had been working the same ground for 150 years. Then New York City needed more water. The city's post-war population was straining the existing reservoir system. Engineers identified the Neversink Valley as the solution. In the late 1940s, the city moved in with condemnation proceedings and appraisers set prices. There was no negotiation. Over 200 families were told what their property was worth and given a date to be out. Headstones were pulled from the cemetery and relocated to higher ground. More than 300 structures were demolished or burned to clear the valley floor. The Neversink Reservoir was completed in 1954. It became part of the Delaware Aqueduct system, which today carries roughly half of New York City's daily drinking water supply to the city. The families who were bought out scattered across Sullivan County and beyond. The community that had held together in that valley for generations did not reassemble anywhere. There is no marker at the waterline, no sign telling drivers on the roads above what the reservoir replaced. Most people who have lived within 20 miles of it their whole lives could not tell you the name of a single family who was displaced. During bad droughts, when the reservoir drops far enough, the old road grades and foundation stones come back above the waterline for a few weeks before the water rises again and covers everything back up. In 1905, New York City made a decision about where its water was going to come from, and 11 communities in the Esopus Creek Valley in Ulster County paid for it. The city needed a reservoir, not a small one. New York's population had been climbing for decades, and the existing water infrastructure could not keep pace. The solution was the Ashokan Reservoir, fed by the Catskill Aqueduct. Construction ran from 1907 to 1915. To build it, the city condemned the entire Esopus Creek Valley. Towns included West Hurley, Olive Branch, Broadhead Bridge, Ashton, Olive City, Bishop Falls, and several others. 11 communities in all. Around 2,000 people were displaced. The city sent appraisers to set land values. Those numbers were what residents received. There was no negotiation, no appeal, and no alternative offer. Families who had been farming that valley since the 1700s were handed a check and told to be somewhere else by a date the city had already chosen. The process was swift and unforgiving. Residents had limited time to relocate or contest the valuations. Some attempted legal remedies, but the city's power of eminent domain could not be challenged in court. Families scattered to neighboring towns and distant cities, severing connections to ancestral land and community roots built over generations. Over 300 buildings were demolished. Some were simply burned. Workers relocated 2,700 graves from 32 separate cemeteries, opened caskets, moved headstones, and reburied the dead on ground above the future waterline. The flooding of the valley began in 1913. By 1915, it was finished. The Esopus Creek Valley, the farms, the churches, the roads those families had built and walked their whole lives, was gone under 12.8 square miles of water. A small memorial at the southern end of the reservoir marks where the communities once stood. Most people drive right past it. The Ashokan still provides roughly 40% of the city's daily water today, and in dry years, when the levels drop, the stone foundations of Olive City come back above the surface for a little while before disappearing again. Cannonsville is the quietest entry among these, and perhaps the most New York because of it. In 1954, New York City's government condemned the West Branch Delaware River Valley in Delaware County. No hearing you could win, no price you could negotiate. The city needed water, and the Cannonsville Valley was where it was going to come from. What that meant for the people living there was simple. They had to leave. 5 hamlets went under: Cannonsville, Rock Royal, Granton, Tonshee, and Rock Rift. More than 1,000 people were displaced. Over 650 buildings were demolished or burned to the ground before the water came in. These were not transient communities. These were farming families who had worked the same West Branch Valley land their great-grandparents had cleared by hand. They had survived the Civil War, the Depression, 2 world wars, and every economic shift in between without losing their farms. Then the city sent an appraiser, set a number, and that was the price. Not an offer. A price. Families who had been on the same ground since the 1700s were handed a check and told the date they needed to be gone. The reservoir filled in 1964. The Cannonsville Reservoir today holds 95 billion gallons and is the largest of New York City's 4 Catskill and Delaware system reservoirs by surface area. Every day it pushes water down through the Delaware Aqueduct toward a city of 8 million people, almost none of whom know the names Rock Royal or Tonshee or Granton. Then 2016 happened. A severe drought dropped the reservoir to 26% of capacity, and when the water fell far enough, the valley came back. Bridge abutments broke the surface. Stone walls appeared in the shallows. The old road grades of Cannonsville Village came back above the waterline for the first time in more than 50 years. People drove from across the state to stand at the edge and look at it. Some of them had grandparents who had lived down there. Some of them were those grandparents. A few weeks later, the reservoir refilled. The walls went back under. The roads disappeared. The water came back up to where the city needed it, and the valley went quiet again. This is number 1 on this list, not because it is the most dramatic or the most violent. It is number 1 because it is the most recent. There are people alive today who watch their family farms get condemned. Their kids remember moving. The Ashokan story from number 2 on this list played out in 1907 to 1915. Cannonsville finished in 1964. That is not ancient history. That is living memory for some of the people watching this right now. And there are 3 other reservoir stories just like it spread across this same region. the Ashokan, the Neversink, the Rondout. New York City built its water system by erasing entire communities, one valley at a time. And most of the people drinking that water have never once thought about what is at the bottom of it. Drop the name of the New York town you believe warrants its own dedicated episode in the comments. And if enough people ask for the same one, that is what we will cover next.